Thank you so much for three incredibly thoughtful, thought-provoking talks. And I'd like to open the floor now to questions, comments, and conversation. Okay, great, please.
I loved your talk. I was kind of curious about contrasting timefulness with timelessness, because I'm thinking about how that sort of imbues like a sense of eternality and endurance. Do you feel like that could be capaciously held by your theory of the timeful? And like the other second parts of that question would be sort of thinking about multiplicity and multitude as like a capacious mode of future projections instead of negative reflections of like, sorry, this is like forming on the ground as we speak, but just thinking about it instead of apocalyptic modes and into these more additive and hopeful registers. I guess I'm curious that I feel that negative projections also have a lot of multiplicity and plurality, and also thinking about it between that and Jahan's talk as well. So I don't know if you could speak to that. It doesn't even seem like a full question, but thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful question. One of the sort of the counter objects or the counter representations that this paper is kind of positioned, well, in conversation with, in tension with, and obviously various kinds of future scenarios of climate fiction, and including kind of hopeful or more equivocal futures. Kim Stanley Robinson stands my neighbor in Davis, and an incredible thinker, Ministry for the Future. Really kind of thinks through technically, descriptively, complexly what a near climate future would look like. It draws on a particular kind of repertoire of narrative thinking and projection, extrapolation. So the form of speculative fiction that is not only apocalyptic, right? So there's a kind of variety of future narrative thinking, novels for near futures that range from the kind of apocalyptic to, we could say, the more hopeful or the more strategic. And another mode of thinking that I'm kind of thinking with and pushing against is climate modeling. And this comes out of, in part, thinking with Amitav Ghosh's most recent book, The Nutmeg's Curse, and throughout his recent critical works, he's thinking about climate modeling and this sort of empirical frameworks for thinking about future disaster, right? So what would it look like if we have, this many 5 degrees Celsius, in 2040, and then thinking about the sort of different potentialities for climate futures, but all with this kind of empirical certainty in a way, right? Even if uncertainty or contingency is built in, there's still the sense of, well, this sort of will happen, right? If these particular variables come to pass, this is what we can expect. And I think we need all of those. So we need these sort of different versions, many versions of timeless thinking, timeful thinking. We need those empirical projections. We need those cli-fi imaginaries. And I think one set of repertoire is a kind of a set of techniques that I see as less attended to are these poetic modes and sort of poetic forms of speculative thinking that really are about the resources of language, kind of condensed, intensified language on the page, language as a kind of seed bank, to use Craig Santos Perez's wonderful image, of kind of intensified, condensed language of resistance, of witness, that we need, and the particular qualities of voice, parataxis, non-linearity. These are all techniques that in some ways, I think with the sort of linear, progressivist, empiricist, exterminative logics of colonialism and capitalism that sort of just are the everyday imaginations that we swim in, right? Everyday forms of accounting, rhetoric that we sort of dwell within, we're steeped in. But we don't have as much literacy in these other modalities, and part of the argument of this paper too is that speculation is like built into poetry, right? That poetry is a kind of imaginative fabulation of what is not but might be, or that's kind of built into poetic modes, and that we might think about and observe the ways in which poets are already thinking about what if, and coordinating that to think about climate presence and futures. So I think we need all of these different modes of thinking with putting pressure on narrativizing, but also providing other kinds of voicings of the problem of time. And poetry is a great kind of resource that we can turn to. And I think both of my co-panelists did such an incredible job of pointing to different versions of those resources, past and present. Thank you. And do you two have?
Of course we have things, but maybe we should take another question.
We'll let that one continue to
Yeah,
unfurl
that'll-
in our near future of this panel. But let's go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, so thank you all for these really wonderful talks. I think they came together, kind of worked together so lovely, in a very lovely way. And sort of just pick up this sort of thread of form, and form sort of being able to voice. That is sort of being very much push things forward, sort of imagine these kind of futures, engage with elegy, things like that. This is sort of this might be sort of tenuous, but I'm very sort of I'm thinking a lot about sort of Tim Morton's sort of ecology without nature. And what I noticed is that the bulk of sort of the examples that you use throughout your presentations engage with the natural world, I think, in very sort of distinct, very sort of direct, very sort of clear ways. And I was wondering if there's a potential, if there's a possibility to engage with the natural world, engage questions of climate crisis without necessarily sort of using the language of sort of the natural, to engage it more through sort of formal procedure. Do you think there's a thread there? Or is there sort of a responsibility for sort of an eco-poetics to use, I guess, quote unquote, eco-language? Openly.
Do you want to take Brian to take that?
Oh gosh, I love that question. I find it so triggering, in a good way, because I really hate Timothy Morton. I really hate him, and I really hate the idea of I just hate tech bros. And I think that's my issue, is when particularly a cisgendered straight white man tells me that I should abandon the language of the ecological and of the material world in favor of a land of concepts. It pisses me off. I think it's bankrupt, and I think it's toxic, and it's bad politics. So I feel ferocious right now, you can tell. So it's possible you could do that. My question would be why the fuck would you want to? Why would you want to be in a world without those things? Why would you not want to use that language? And when daddy comes along and is don't use that language, it's some romantic, idea about connection with nature. I'm fuck you, daddy. Actually, I don't believe you. That said, I think his provocations are really useful. And my rage actually against him is really useful for me as a thinker. Because as you can tell from my talk, I do think there's a patriarchal telos to Western science that has led us here. And this notion that somehow I as an individual in my poem needs to somehow solve this entire telos is insane. I don't think any of us can do that. we can, again, imagine alternatives, or, we can do all sorts of things, but we can't single-handedly reconstruct the history of Western science and come up with a new social structure all in one poem. I would love to see that poem, but I think it's really dangerous to ask us to think about climate crisis without thinking about materiality and the materiality of more than human things and the interface of more than human things with human society. I think social ecology, those of you who take my classes, know that for me, the interface between the social and the ecological feels like a really important, both political and aesthetic way of thinking and going forward. And so I think when especially someone who only refers to white, male, Western thinkers the way that Morton does, I'm really suspicious of that sort of whole epistemology. And I feel like when that is the ideology, because it is an ideology, that is also unexamined and uncritical of itself, the way, sadly, some of this telos often is. I get really annoyed because I do care personally about more than human beings and literal ecology. And so I'm it really annoys me when his work really annoys me. That said, it can be really helpful, hyper-objects, the idea of the hyper-object. It's useful. I also think it's fucked up and disempowering, but it's also useful. So he's someone, I really struggle with him, and I really struggle with some of the things he asks us to disavow in a way. And those disavowals, I think we need to be really thoughtful about. Because what he often asks us to give up, I think is too much to give up, and it is too in line with what we have already been asked to give up. And that, I think, is wrong. I like how the machine is now shut up. You've been on your rant.
That was the machine snaps.
But I don't, that was not a level-headed response. That was a very emotional response. So you're more usefully engaged with him, I think.
That leads into a question I had, though, which was over spring break I went down and toured the Greenbrier's Doomsday Bunker. And in the bunker itself were 3 books, on one of the bookshelves. One of them was Road to Survival by William Vogt, which was a 1949 apocalyptic environmentalism work. The other one was The Andromeda Strain. And then one was The Evolution of Social Progress by one of the Jesuit thought leaders in America.
That's amazing.
I know.
I love this story.
I had to context that. I've been trying to write about this, and it's pissed me off so much that Congress would go hang out in the Vanderbilt's place, hotel, while the rest of us burn. And I'm wondering where, in most of the poems that I've read for Professor Ramazani's class, there's a dignified elegiac register.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the appropriate place for rage, being pissed off, and why don't we see more of it? Why is it all kind of dignity?
You're so much more dignified than I am.
Sorry?
You go.
No, it's okay. You go. You got it.
Right, we're just being so friends. There's so much contemporary eco-poetry that's mining that vein. I think Tommy Pico's Nature poem is a great, example. I think, even some of the poems by Craig Santos Perez, which play with humor and satire. I think Brian's poems often explore rage and this more antagonistic forms. Juliana Spar, who Jahan was speaking about, her poems are kind of often set in scenes of antagonism, climate strength. So I think there maybe because the emphasis in our talks today was on elegy and address and but Brian's talk gave us a wonderful early version of poems kind of set at a scene of devastation, of disaster, dispossession, Claire, and we can trace the kind of whole itinerary of poets exploring dispossession, immiseration, climate, grief, loss, but with a desire to fight back. And I think maybe because we were focusing on lyric and elegy, some of those elements didn't come out quite as strongly, but I think that's definitely kind of built into the traditions of eco-poetics, at least that I'm the most interested in, is a kind of centralizing of antagonism, right? The antagonism is at the root of ecological crisis, of dispossession, of all of these forms of climate change, right? It's ultimately a crisis of capitalism and colonialism and an outcome, an ongoing outcome of those long systems of power and hierarchy. So I think the poems, that turn to that and that try to illuminate that are the poems that are the most, culturally, socioecologically insightful. And there's a rich tradition of that. I just want to say too, just to kind of get back to that question a moment ago, say one kind of other response that I would make to your question, not so much in relationship to Morton, which I, would co-sign in some ways, is that I think that one of the things that poems can do is model processes rather than describe, right? That there's a kind of modeling that can happen. A poem enacts rather than kind of moving through a chronology or imploding, right? So to the extent that I think we might kind of turn to form and away from like ecological content that I think is at the root of your question, I think poems have that kind of affordance built in, modeling processing, right? So mattering. I think that can be done and is being done by a wide array of poets without the kind of political ideology that Brian is objecting to in Morton's work and some of the other kind of object-oriented ontologies and we'll say new materialisms, which have a kind of flattening out of political antagonism.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, because I'm focusing on grief, one shouldn't think there, that means, weeping and lying down and, whatever in this kind of prone position, something like that. I mean, again, in elegy, there's always been a space for fury and anger. We think even of back to Lycidas and St. Peter and, this kind of apocalyptic rage that enters into that poem. And I think, we see that in any number of these poems. Sometimes it's overt. Margaret writes really well about a poem that Juliana Spar co-authored, that in which the word "fuck" is very fuck this, fuck that is, and all the rage that involves. And you do this sometimes too. The kind of anger comes out really overtly. So I think, and even in these moments of seemingly distanced, ironic, satiric stuff, I mean, it seems to me when you say Polynesia sunk, in this acerbic way, or Middle East same old time, there's a kind of fury, steely fury behind that as well. So I think again, I think that's a great question, but I think even the lyric poems that we're talking about, if you look a little bit sometimes below the surface, it's there.
I just also, now that I feel calm, I wanted to say, like, I think as a practitioner, when I'm not thinking in my scholar brain, but I'm thinking about from a practice standpoint, for me, like, the question of form, because I am someone who, like, counts syllables and loves detail work and is, like, really thinks about craft and sort of also the poem as a process. Like, I am so interested in, like, process-based writing, durational practice, somatics, all of that kind of stuff. But for me, like, I think I really, again, those of you who've taken class with me know, like, for me, I really can no longer subjugate, like, the ground of the social and the political and questions of justice to my questions of craft always, like, and of process, that I would hope that they could be coextensive and enacted at the same time, which I think is maybe also why I overreacted to your question of, like, well, don't get rid of the ground, like, that's bad. That's my own solution of, like, I wouldn't want that to disappear in favor only of aesthetic questions, while I am also in love with the aesthetic questions. That's why I'm a writer, right? But I am always hopeful that one can do them at the same time, and that one could find the right kinds of processes, formal expressions to kind of hold the ground of the social and the questions of justice alongside, you know, one's interest in, like, how to articulate them. What's the style? What is the style of eco-justice? Like, what is, and that's not a trivial question, you know, like, because I think it's, as we have all acknowledged, it's changing really fast. And I think our forms have to be hyper-responsive to those questions too, and our processes as writers. So I think it's why also I have skepticism. Those of y'all who've taken class with me know, like, there's a lot of tension between, like, sort of static concepts and processes, and, like, being alive and improvisatory as opposed to attached to specific concepts or ideals. And then how, when you have a world built out of, and policy built out of concepts and ideas and models, etc., like, how do you actually navigate this reality built by others, actually, with a very highly technocratic language, and create poetic form that's still alive and can outsmart it or outwit it or maneuver around it. And sometimes for me that just involves abandoning, like, some of what we've received, you know, like, as poets. Sometimes. Some people do it really well, like, take, like, Craig taking Stevens and doing a parody. But yeah, so I think that's, I would hope one could always not necessarily have to abandon things entirely, or the material world or ecological language entirely, in favor of the kinds of aesthetic explorations or aesthetic questions. Yeah.
We're sort of coming up on time, but we still have a few questions. Can we maybe take one more?
Sure.
We can make it very short.
Sure.
Yes.
Or you know, if people want to say their questions, and then maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
When we,
could everybody say their questions, and then we could try to address
Wrap
some of them,
it
but
all
then
together.
address some of them in the break as well,
Yeah.
like in informal conversation.
Yeah, that's
All at the same time?
Oh no. So how about Chip, and then
Oh, I'm Casey.
what's your
Oh,
name?
I'm Casey.
Casey, and then Kristen, and then River. Okay.
You know, even if we don't get to answer the questions, I think
We
hearing
want
the
to hear
questions
Yeah.
would be really valuable.
Please make your remarks, please.
Chip.
Chip,
Want me to
go ahead.
voice our questions?
Yes.
Yes. Everyone's going to say their question.
Here it is Good Friday afternoon, and I'm thinking that a couple of biblical genres haunt almost everything that we've heard about. One is prophecy, which models processes, which plays around very creatively and provokingly with verb tense and temporality, and the other, and which energizes. The other is apocalypse, which is, comparatively speaking, static. It is the depiction of a state or a result of processes. The sort of the plot is over now, and the party has begun with apocalypse. Whether it's utopian or dystopian party. Just those categories, it might be useful from a literary point of view to go no further than to say, maybe we don't want to toss around apocalyptic as a term without thinking about it as what it is, a literary genre that has been studied, that has its limitations as well as its strengths. So, is that, it's more an observation than a question, but maybe do you agree that prophecy informs what you were all talking about for the last hour? Because it seems to me that it did.
Thumbs up.
Casey.
Oh yeah, first of all, this is mainly for Margaret, but anyone can chip in. I really enjoyed your talk. It was really fluidly delivered and very insightful. My main question is about kind of your focus on immediacy rather than long-term catastrophe, and like thinking of like this environmental poetry genre as like one of call to action, whether like implied or kind of overt, getting the reader to like act in a certain way to prevent climate disaster. And I was thinking, I want to get your thoughts on your kind of like how immediacy lends itself to like different kind of calls to action than like poetry of catastrophe. And I was curious, kind of, yeah, like what does immediacy do that kind of long-term poetry of catastrophe might not? Or how can they be read in like kind of complementary ways to inspire readers to act in like in different ways, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Kristen?
I know Tommy Pico's nature poem came up, which I've spent a lot of time with lately. I just was curious to hear more about, with like Nicole Seymour's bad environmentalism in mind, to hear more about these very, oftentimes very like contrasting affective modes that a lot of these poets, or some poets have been taking that are very different from, more reverent approaches, more, traditional ways of engaging with the environment. I just would really be curious to hear more about what role you think that plays in, whether it's in an elegy or in any other like lyric form right now.
And River?
So I just had a question mainly about audiences, and I think when I'm either writing eco-poetry or writing about eco-poetry, there's always on my mind this fear that the people who could have the most impact on environmental crisis and catastrophe will never be the audience of any of these works because of their own refusal or their own lack of access, but maybe refusal. And that creates sort of its own category of despair or its own sort of line of despair and destruction. And I'm just curious, in your work or in the work of the poets you study, how do people address that sort of parallel despair versus the despair of the crisis itself? And then there's the lack of impact and lack of power that writing can have on the CEOs and the
I think the best person for that is Brenda Hillman, in part because, we've read Practical Water together, but, she has a poem called The Value of Useless Protest, and then she also, in her own prose, she does document, she's someone who like literally will go to the office of her local Congress, as I told you in class, and, do the protest and then be like, and if you don't vote the right way, I will put you in a poem. And will really make those threats. And so I do think she is someone who both also has like a variety of tones, like whimsical, super weird, funny, biting, and doesn't actually tend to hew to one, doesn't really do eco-elegy in like actually a conventional way. And which may be why people don't write about her quite as much. It's like, cause she's wiggly. But I think she would be a great person, River.
I think what we're hearing is that a lot of different emergent strategies are necessary and that our affective investments are not shared. So why don't we cogitate on all of these wonderful questions. We do need to take a break because we're coming back to start with Jury Ground in 11 minutes, and then